First and foremost, the strategy has to call out semiconductors as a sector in and of its own right, in the same way that the CHIPS Act called out from all the other research that was been going on that this is something we need to do.
Hello and welcome to Perspectives with Neilo. I'm your host, Neilo Sullivan. If this is your first time joining our podcast, you might be interested to know that you can find all of our past episodes on our blog site at pwneilo.com or by searching for Perspectives with Neilo on your favourite podcast app. In this episode, we're talking about the EU CHIPS Act and why the EU, the US and others are trying to take back control of their semiconductor supply chains amid concerns that have intensified since Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's increasingly aggressive behaviour against Taiwan. My guest is Dr. Denis Doyle, who is currently board chair of the Tyndall National Institute based at University College Cork. Denis has been a leader in the semiconductor industry for over 30 years and has run large and complex silicon manufacturing facilities with complex global supply chains both in Ireland and in the United States. He spoke to us in a personal capacity about Ireland's engagement with the EU CHIPS Act, the need for a national semiconductor strategy and much more. So Denis, you're very welcome to the podcast. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
Delighted to be here and it's a pleasure to meet you, Neil, and looking forward to having a chat on these very important topics.
Great. So maybe we'll start with taking a look at the global semiconductor industry. Sales exceeded 600 billion in 2022, and industry leaders tell us that it's poised to reach revenues of over $1 trillion by the end of the decade. And so the semiconductor industry is often used as an umbrella term for what is a multifaceted, multi-layered business. And so if we try to break it into its different areas or segments, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what those areas are.
Well, first of all, in terms of the industry overall, while the revenue from semiconductor companies is of the order of 600 billion, you can put a factor of 10 onto that, where it multiplies up into the whole ICT industry. So you're talking about 6 trillion worth of revenue or value being generated by the semiconductor industry. And the reason I'm bringing that up, because I think it's an important point, is whereas maybe 50 years ago semiconductors were new, they were breakthrough and so forth, and they still are, they've become now foundational for every industry on the planet. And to some extent, we forgot about the semiconductor industry for many years while we concentrated obviously on, social media platforms, or while we, life sciences and other medical devices, the auto industry got the headlines. Semiconductor industry was still, heavily researching in the background, but almost was lost in the consciousness of the general public and indeed the policymakers. And that kind of came to a shuddering halt, with the pandemic, because suddenly the need for more computers for people working from home, for more, if you like, storage space and so forth, created an unprecedented demand surge suddenly. And this came about on the other side, where the supply chains were completely disrupted by COVID. And, you got into this, we big chip shortages, and people's consciousness and awareness of the semiconductor industry, if you like, resurfaced, and the importance of it. So I think that's a very important benchmark. And then obviously the war in Ukraine, while impacting somewhat on the supply chain, also brought into focus very sharply the Taiwan-China situation, because the dependence on the semiconductor industry on Taiwan in particular, is a cause for concern worldwide, particularly among policymakers. So, the semiconductor industry is a really foundational industry. It's a real important industry for the whole world, for the whole digitization, for any sector you can think of. But we kind of forgot about it for a long time. And, while, one thing that has come out of the pandemic is this, if you like, re-emergence of semiconductors as being strategically important. So with that being said, the question you asked me are the different sectors. We have a very broad, when we say semiconductors, we're talking about materials. Everyone thinks of silicon, which obviously is around computers, But there's lots of other materials and a lot of other applications, ranging from your kind of your memory and your processor on your PC to the communications we have with 4G, 5G, now 6G, fiber optics, and a very important part of communications. But then you've got other end of the spectrum, power, semiconductors, semiconductors for power delivery, for switches and so forth, which are more discrete rather than integrated. So it's a vast spectrum that is covered in semiconductors. Imaging is another example, and particularly whether it be, X-ray imaging, or whether it be, even our photography, displays, another part of the semiconductor industry as well. So it's a vast, vast industry, and it covers, not just a broad spectrum, but it's very deep as well in terms of the skills and the different disciplines that are required within it. So yes, it's an umbrella term, semiconductor, but it's a huge, huge industry. And as I said earlier, it's foundational. And I think that's the really important message I'd like to kind of deliver.
And who would be the major players in this? What are the big kind of company names that we could associate with this industry? And I suppose the second thing, to kind of just get a bit of an understanding of the supply chain, is where are these major players located?
Well, that's a good question, because it depends on the layers of the semiconductor industry you're in. Everyone, would think straight away of some company like Intel. But in many respects, Intel are supplying, if you like, processors, and have been for 50, 60 years. They're both manufacturing and designing these processors. So they're embedded in the supply chain vertically as well. But then, of course, these processors are used in all sorts of telecommunication devices, or in industrial automation equipment and so forth. So the big players, are any player in the world is using semiconductors. So the question is really, I think you're asking, who are the marquee names if you just stick to the semiconductors? And you're talking really the Intels, from being a big one, the Samsung, and the memory companies like Micron, Renesas. Interesting, would you call Apple a semiconductor company? They're certainly, designing their own chips, and they're getting them manufactured. So they're now someone who would be in a kind of, if you like, a system, now that they're a main player as well. And then you've got other, European ones would be around Infineon, NXP, ST Microelectronics, Analog Devices, who I'm very familiar with, Texas Instruments, a lot of names that may not come to the public attention that's because they're not in customer users in the general population. They're normally embedded in equipment. A layer down, I think, is very important, because you'll hear a lot talked about maybe the foundries, people like TSMC, Global Foundries, who are manufacturers of semiconductor chips for other companies. And I think I wouldn't call them contract manufacturers, because they're much more specialized than that. But they're the big players, particularly TSMC, and they have a huge presence in the semiconductor market.
And nowadays, most, but not all, chip companies have outsourced the chip manufacturing piece. I mean, you mentioned Intel there. They do their own manufacturing. They're one of the exceptions, I suppose. But many have outsourced their chip manufacturing business. And my question is, I guess, how did the industry evolve to be like this? And why is it now a concern for some regions like the EU?
Well, the whole semiconductor industry from day one has been governed by what's called Moore's Law, which was a simple statement that the number of transistors on a circuit would double every 18 months or 2 years or whatever. And that law drove the industry and made chips get smaller and smaller and smaller, get circuits get bigger and bigger and bigger, forced the prices down over the years and so forth as the demand got higher and higher, and we got bigger and bigger scale. So Moore's Law has really been the metronome, I would say, for the semiconductor industry. But there has been some, if you like, unintended consequences of that. Because if you're going at that pace, and if the cost of manufacturing at the next generation keeps doubling and getting higher and higher and higher, fewer and fewer companies can afford, if you like, the investment for the next generation. To build a module for a semiconductor fab today at the latest node would be, easily 10 billion. so you're $10 billion. So I mean, it's not something that many companies can afford to keep up at that pace. So if you're a CEO or a CFO in a semiconductor company in the last 20 years, and you want to, increase your capacity, you've basically two choices. You can build capacity, spend the money and the investment, the capital, and get that return over the long term. Or you can say, well, I'll go to somebody who'll do this for me, but who will do it for everyone else as well. So they can achieve scale that I can't. So I get the advantage of that I don't have to spend the capital. I get the advantage of lower prices because I'm using the scale of everyone else to achieve those lower prices. And the big advantage is in the short term, it's a variable cost. I can pay for the wafers, and if I don't need them, I don't pay for them. So there's no, if you like, fixed cost. That's very attractive. And those, if you like, financial benefits are all short term, right? So, and very, very attractive. The downside of going to, I don't like to call it the outsource model, it's actually the foundry model, because it's much more nuanced than that. In the foundry model, you have to use the same process as everybody else. You're losing to some extent any competitive advantage you may or may not have in your ability to tailor your own manufacturing process.
And this is the technology.
This is the technology or the latest node. So that's if you like a disadvantage. You also become, if you like, reliant on that company then to produce your product for you. And you're relying on them to do that in the long term. So you become strategically dependent on that company. And it's a tough business to be in, this foundry model. And really the most successful one has been TSMC, who built the scale big enough so they can make themselves attractive to a lot of other semiconductor companies. And that's attractiveness has led to this dependence on one company and one, if you like, one region, mainly Taiwan. So it's always been this balance about what's the short-term financial gain versus the kind of strategic dependence you have on this company and its longevity. And there's also another fundamental, you're also relying on them to deliver capacity when you need it. And up to, say, 2019, this worked beautifully because there was unlimited capacity. TSMC continued to invest, and capacity, but when was being added. But when the constraint came on, then the companies relying on this foundry model ended up with saying, okay, I can't be certain of my future capacity. I can't be certain that I am going to be able to achieve my growth figures because now I'm dependent on this company. And that's why the strategic importance of the China thing became very important, and why people kind of had to reevaluate this short-term gain financially versus this long-term strategic dependence on this one company. So it's always been a very difficult balancing act. But the point I'd really want to make is it was known. It isn't that this just suddenly blew up in our face. It was always a kind of going to happen at some stage. It's just it went so well for about 20, 25 years that people forgot, kind of almost took it for granted, to some extent. And that's why, as I said earlier, I do believe a lot of the semiconductor industry went out of the consciousness of the policymakers and the public in general.
But post-pandemic and now with some new, geopolitical, a different geopolitical climate, there's a renewed awareness on this supply chain and having it be more determinate. And I suppose this is maybe one of the reasons why the EU Chips Act has come about. And the EU Chips Act was announced in February 2022, and the EU Council formally approved it in July 2023. And the US has been doing similar things. They've passed their Chips and Science Act in 2022. South Korea, we believe, are doing the same. So I guess the question is, what's going on with all these Chips Acts? Is this supply chain problem? Is that what they're aiming to solve that you talked about? Is that the motivation for them?
The real motivation is that, Europe as a big consumer of semiconductors has realized, because of the pandemic particularly, and also because of the geopolitical situation, that it has a huge reliance and its companies have a huge reliance on semiconductors coming out of one location from one company. Now, albeit there are other foundries, and I should mention that, but when we talk about Taiwan, we're really talking about TSMC. There's a huge reliance on one country and one company, and if anything shocks the geopolitical system happens, then that can have huge impact on Europe and the West in general. So this reliance has forced the two main blocs in the world, the other two main blocs, the EU and the US, to sit up and say, okay, we need to make sure that not as reliant on one location as we have been in the past. So they basically have, as you said, put into law these CHIPS Acts, which basically, if you like, encourages the, if you like, investment in semiconductors across the entire supply chain in Europe and in the US's case, in the US as well, and obviously Korea and others have theirs. So that's what those CHIPS Acts are about. They're about redressing the balancing of this kind of lopsided strategic and, if you like, geographical imbalance. And I think it's not, and it has worked, because I think there's been a lot of recent announcements, and the most obvious one was for the company TSMC based in Taiwan to set up in the US and to set up in Europe, and that's exactly what they've done, right? No doubt encouraged by the Europeans encouraging him to do that. And I find what's interesting is so far, the announcements, particularly in Europe, around Global Foundries, who are another foundry with ST, and also TSMC with Bosch, NXP, and ST, are an alliance with their companies, with their customers. So TSMC isn't just setting up in Europe, they're forming a joint venture with their customers, which is trying to redress from the customer's point of view the imbalance, this kind of, if you like, a hybrid between doing it ourselves internally versus doing it completely, outsourcing it to TSMC. Well, we'll let TSMC manufacture it, but we own some of the company. So to some extent, it's a hybrid model now to address some of the shortcomings and the strategic issue. It doesn't readdress them all, but it does, for the given generation at least, guarantee those companies that I mentioned capacity into the for the near-term future as well, for the near-term future. So I do think it's interesting that those alliances have formed, which comes back maybe with a point later about how come they didn't come to Ireland. Well, TSMC were all going to go where their customers in Europe were, which was namely Infineon and Bosch are in Germany and NXP are in Holland. So they were, it's probably more likely they were, no matter what we offered, that they would actually end up locating close to their customer for that reason. I think the other one we should mention too is Intel, because Intel always had a footprint in Europe and in the US and in Israel as well. So they weren't as geographically dependent for their wafer manufacturing in Taiwan and so forth. So they, have continued to invest in their fabs worldwide. But an interesting point for them is they've moved into the foundry business as well. And indeed, I'm sure some of their factory in Dublin or in Leixlip, is concerned with this foundry business. So in some ways, it's great that they're in that business from a strategic point of view, because TSMC and others need competition, and you have competition for one of the best manufacturers in the world. But I think it's important for Ireland as well that they succeed in that business, because that can only lead to, if you like, further investment down the road in the Irish site as well. So they've announced factories in Germany and other facilities in Italy and Poland and so forth. So we're an important part of that ecosystem as well.
So let's talk a little bit maybe about the funding model for the EU CHIPS Act that's going to enable all of this, right, or help drive it. I mean, maybe I can first ask you, is like, for the EU CHIPS Act, how much is involved? And secondly, are there any notable differences as regards the regulations around the funding?
Without going into too much detail on the CHIPS Act, I think, the headline figure is 43 billion. However, we're in the middle of a budgetary period for the EU. So I think it's important to point out that this isn't extra money. This is money that's being, say I won't say taken from other programs. That's the wrong way to look at it. It's more ring fenced for semiconductors within existing programs and so forth, or rearranging or restructuring of programs. So that's an important point. It's not extra money, but what it does do, it allows individual national governments to increase their funding into, if you like, supporting the development of a semiconductor industry in their countries. So it allows, whether it be the Germans, the French, or indeed the Irish, to put in more money into getting semiconductor companies formed and investing in them without running into, if you like, state aid rules that maybe would have hampered them in the past. So I think that's the big takeaway. It's not extra money, but it has been effective. And I think that's really important. That'll come later on, maybe when we talk about kind of what Ireland needs to do. But even having a headline that says we're going to kind of focus on this, we're going to ring fence money, we'll allow national governments, has had almost an immediate impact in gaining investment from the big semiconductor companies.
So it seems that many EU states anticipated the finalising of the EU Chips Act in July of this year and began engaging in investment discussions with like-minded countries and partners many months before. And some have already announced partnerships, like you mentioned, the TSMC Germany deal. Ireland, according to the Sunday Business Post, was not among the 20 signatories of the original EU Chips Declaration back in March of 2021. But the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment did put out a request for public consultation in March of 2022. I believe Tyndall were one of the contributors to the reply, according to the consultation report published in May of 2022. But I guess the question does come up looking at the kind of timeline here. Are Ireland a little late to this game?
When you frame it like that, you could say yes. But I think that would be to underestimate, say, for example, the work that the IDA do on an ongoing basis. So, I have no doubt, absolutely no doubt, that the IDA were chasing TSMC, they were chasing other investments and so forth. They were up against severe competition, right? Could we have helped them more? I think is probably where I think, we have room for improvement, right? So I don't think... I don't think there has been a negative impact to date on anything we've done. I think we've got to look at this now, what we need to do going forward. But also I think we need to look at this, in the long term. What do we need in the long term? As I said earlier on, the investment in TSMC in Germany probably was beyond us. It would have been great, but it wasn't. Now, there are others in place. Samsung, for example, haven't announced any kind of global expansion to my knowledge, certainly not into Europe. And, so I presume that's still in play. And I'm sure there's other areas in play. And also, as I mentioned earlier on, the semiconductor industry is vast. These are the headline ones, right? There's a lot more, layers and areas that Ireland can win on and are winning and continuing to win on. I mean, if you look at the semiconductor industry in its, what we would say here in terms of, obviously the Intels, the analog devices at the manufacturing end, and the Microsemi as a manufacturing end. And then you've got a lot of design houses, like the big ones are all here. Infineon are here, Bosch are here, Renesas are here. The other companies like Cadence, Synopsys are here. Qualcomm, a big RF company, are here. MACOM, a big RF company. So, the IDA in Ireland have been very, very successful in attracting those. So we shouldn't be overcritical and saying, have we missed the boat here, right? I think we should take a long-term view, and I think that's probably the way to look at it. There was always going to be a kind of headlines in the short term, response to the CHIPS Act. We probably couldn't compete in terms of the level of investment that was required. But we do need to get our act together in terms of coherently putting forward not just relying on the IDA or EI to do startups and SFI to do R&D. We need to coordinate it. So we need to have our own strategy, our own CHIPS Act in many respects, as much for a label as anything else to kind of show we're serious in the round.
I suppose there are other smaller European countries, though, like Lithuania, who have struck deals on the research side with Taiwan and various institutions in Taiwan to build those collaboration connections. But staying with Ireland for a minute, when you say like the companies you mentioned, they're all here. There were only two companies here manufacturing chips. That would be Analog Devices and Intel, but all the others are mostly doing design. Tell us a little more about the chips industry in Ireland and what the different elements or distribution of technologies or activity we have here.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you have to make the chips, right? And that in itself is a technology, and we talked about Moore's Law earlier on. So, and the main ones here obviously are Analog Devices and Intel. But then you have to design chips later on. And designing chips is where a lot of the IP value is. That's that's where a lot of the value in the IC comes from. And to design that, we have a lot of the design companies here. Whether it be, we have AMD here. I should have mentioned them earlier on, who recently bought Xilinx. You have Intel themselves have a design center here. People like Jaguar Land Rover who have design center here. You have, Infineon, who bought Cypress, are here. onsemi are here. So there's a lot of design companies who are designing chips. So that's a discipline of its own. And the government have, through what's called, and the industry through MCCI, which is based in Tyndall, is a kind of a research institute, kind of encouraging the kind of skills and the research into that. So that's really important. So go back lower down the supply chain. Ireland, between semiconductors and between shall we say the life science industries, are experts in building clean rooms. Right, so there's a lot of contract companies out there that are expert in that area. A lot of, if you like, people servicing equipment in the big manufacturing companies, and these are high-end, multi-million-dollar pieces of equipment that need maintenance and so forth. So we have a huge skill base in that area as well, in terms of servicing equipment as well. So, and so we have a broad spectrum to design. The chips are so big these days; they need a lot of verification and automation in terms of their design. And we have a lot of the big, if you like, verification companies here, like Cadence, Synopsys, and so forth. So so we have, if you like, a lot of the ecosystem. And I think, without getting too much into what the strategy should be, it'd be very tempting to go after a very, high profile one or two wins, whereas the ecosystem is huge. And, it's as important to have all, to have a lot of, there's a lot of, if you like, alternative paths we can go down, and where we have expertise and where we can build on what we already have, and if you like, build the whole ecosystem rather than just relying on a kind of a high profile one. And you talked about maybe diversification. That's so the semiconductor industry is probably very diversified, right? Which is great, but it's probably probably niche in terms of its people recognizing it as an industry because it is so diversified. But it's the other thing I should have mentioned is those companies we talked about are on the leading edge, but many of, if you like, the semiconductor industry is on older technology and older nodes, and that's to do with the life cycle of products. If you buy a microprocessor that goes into your car, the life cycle of the car can be 10. Your car could be 10 years, but the model could last for 10, 15 years. So you will need the same processor. And the same with industrial equipment. The life cycle of some of these technologies can be 10, 20, 30 years. So these are called legacy nodes. And while, if you like, the high profile ones at the moment are at the advanced nodes, there's still an opportunity that we need capacity, at least in manufacturing and other areas, in legacy nodes. And if you like, the investment that Analog Devices have made, recently announced, I think it was 630 million euro, was to triple their capacity, not at the leading edge, but at nodes, if you like, that where they have a huge market and which they see is going to grow. So I suppose the point I'm trying to make is the semiconductor industry is big. And the basis of your question was, have we lost out? Well, we may have lost out in particular high-profile projects, but there's a rich space still to explore, and I'm sure the IDA, are very much aware of that.
So let's talk a little bit then about how we, if we haven't lost out, how we can maybe, or what the right strategy should be to take advantage of this CHIPS Act for Ireland, and how, like as you put it, could we develop our own Irish CHIPS Act and secure the industry here and develop the industry here for the future. I mean, it's a vast industry, like you say, but Tyndall have published a recent paper on Ireland's role in the global semiconductor industry. They say we need a national computer chip strategy. So what does that mean? What does a national computer chip strategy? What fundamentals do we need to develop to make sure we do this right?
Well, I think the important point, and I think we alluded to the CHIPS Act, just the fact that there was a CHIPS Act attracted, said people that the EU were serious about it. So I think that would be my first and foremost comment. Having a strategy is important, but in and of itself, to have a strategy, rather than like if you look at it, we have the IDA who are out there, if you like, pushing, for foreign direct investment. We have, EI, trying to grow our indigenous sector, and we also have, who are kind of one of the biggest funders of startups and so forth. We have Science Foundation Ireland, which are a big provider of R&D funding in Ireland to the various areas. We have the Tyndall, which I'm obviously very familiar with, which is providing the National Institute for the research and so forth. We've all the universities who have courses in microelectronics, all the different aspects of it and what the industry need. But what we don't have is how are these all joined up under a common framework where we're having the impact of those collectively is greater than the impact that they're having individually. So, I'm always going to ask for more funding, but take funding aside, right? You'd have to say, that we could do having a framework or having a title of the Ireland's National Chips Strategy shows that we're kind of making the most impact with what we're doing already. But it also, shows to the investors, both startups and to the kind of foreign direct investment community, that we are serious about this industry, that we want to grow this industry. And also probably the biggest audience that I'm concerned about is to kids at school. This industry needs talent. It needs, people coming into this industry. And as I said, because it had been lost in the consciousness of the public for, 20 years, the input or, people have gone on to do computer science in the engineering fields and have joined, the kind of the software and type companies, rather than going into the more hardware type companies. Because they didn't see it. It wasn't conscious to them that these are great, exciting areas to work in. So if you think the courses and the modules that are taken up at our universities, haven't been taken up. The number of people entering PhD programs in Ireland from the Irish system has only increased, I think, by 2.5% in the last 15 years. So we need to, have it as in the same way as the CHIPS Act, as out there front and center and saying, we are taking this seriously. This is an important industry. So we need to identify it first and foremost before even we talk about the details of the strategy. We need to have it out there as a sector. Everyone knows what life science sector is, or the pharma sector is, or what the kind of semiconductors is loosely under technology. But to most people and kids these days, technology means, the platform software companies. It doesn't mean semiconductors. So first and foremost, the strategy has to call out semiconductors as a sector in and of its own right, in the same way that the CHIPS Act called out from all the other research that was been going on, that this is something we need to do. So I think that's the most important point to mention. It needs to be a sector, and we need to have a strategy, and we need to have joined up thinking. Now, what are the elements of the strategy? It'd be wrong of me to presume, if you work with industry leaders, if you work with the kind of the various government departments, if you look at the universities, what the outcome of that strategy should be. Some people would say, we should focus and prioritise in certain areas. I would be of the view, and this is my own personal view, is that we need to do what we've always done, is focus on the fundamentals. So, if you think, what are the fundamentals? The recent, shall we say, crisis in energy or energy shortage hasn't helped our cause for attracting manufacturing industry. Debate, whatever about the rights and wrongs about data centers hasn't helped attract, companies into Ireland because, it's a basic, that we need to have the power to going forward. Now, I'm very certain that we will have this power going forward. We will have green power, whether that mainly through wind energy, both onshore, fixed offshore. But recently, I'm not sure, the economic report on the Shannon Estuary identified floating wind power as being able to provide, shall we say, 10 times our current needs. So, we will get there. But we need a plan in the meantime as to how we fill that gap in the most kind of sustainable and green way possible. So we need to have an energy policy, right, that it would be part of the strategy, and to lower the prices and to ensure security. Then we need, shall we say, in other areas, I know they're working on the planning issues at the moment, but and these are common across many of the sectors. Planning can be an issue and it needs to be streamlined. Most importantly, it needs to be certain. It needs to be defined and people know what process is being followed, and given certainty and how long it can take. And I suppose mainly, on my side of it, where I'm coming from, is the educational side. We need to have, if you like, a fundamental look of how we're attracting people into semiconductors and how we're going to train up people maybe who are already in the industry or who are in other industry and cross-train them. That would have to be very much part of it. And then I suppose, given my role in Tyndall, the R&D sector needs to be enhanced even further, and not just by funding, but working, as you say, collaborating with other institutions across the European Union and so forth. We need to continue to invest. I often say, when you look at the investment that was made in Tyndall, and its predecessor in the 80s, which was called the National Microelectronics Centre, which would like to think helped, train a lot of people who are, executives in various companies today, whether it be analog devices, it was formed before Intel came on the scene. I'd like to think it helped part of that decision of Intel to come here. So that investment in the 80s is still paying off today in terms of the people that were and the research that was done, for Ireland. So, I would always argue the case, you cannot put enough money into R&D. There's a balance between the short-term issues and the long-term issues, but investing, and the Irish always have done this, investing in education, has always for centuries proved to be our platform to progress.
But I guess one question that comes to mind, Dennis, who can lead this? I mean, government, multiple departments, it seems like there's multiple areas involved. Who should lead it?
That's a good question. Certainly the stakeholders are clear. Like as you said, there's multiple, government agencies involved. There's obviously the IDA, Enterprise Ireland, Science Foundation Ireland, Tyndall National Institute, obviously has a big role and is willing to play whatever role that it's asked to play in that. But the industry itself, whether it be through Midas, which is the kind of designer company grouping, or the manufacturing companies like Intel, they have to be part of it, as does the educational, the third level in particular, and also some second level, if you like, career guidance to kind of highlight the importance of this industry to basically to our future. As to who would lead it, that's really would be a decision for I would say the Minister for Enterprise would be my view on that one, right? So I wouldn't like to preempt him on that one.
I had a question for you about diversification. This is a question that some people have alluded to based on Central Statistics Office numbers, and there was a recent report also from the European think tank network on China, and they say that 64% of Ireland's chip exports last year in 2022 were to China. Over 8 billion euro of exports. In fact, our exports to China, semiconductor exports to China, have been steadily growing since 2011. Some journalists have said that, given the kind of seismic success story that this is, it's kind of unusual that the government haven't been celebrating this success. But I think on a slightly different point, given the recent geopolitical tensions that we mentioned regarding China's hostile threats to annex Taiwan and US-China relations, and indeed the downturn in the Chinese economy, the ETNC report highlights that this may be an area of a risk for Ireland, the fact that we are so dependent on exports to China. Is that something, do you think we should be worried about? Is this, or should diversification be part of an Ireland Chips Act plan?
I think I don't know the statistics and I don't know the numbers, but I would say exports to China come into two categories. Finished product sales to Chinese companies, right? And trade is trade, and it isn't that Ireland or that the semiconductor companies won't trade with China, obviously subject to export rules and so forth, right? But I would say the bulk of that number you talked about is from intercompany transfers where, and I can imagine the big manufacturing companies here who produce the wafers and then they're assembled and packaged in China, and that their back-end facilities are there, and then it's only an intercompany transfer. So Intel, for example, have announced packaging is being set up in Italy. So I think the market will do that for us in the sense of where the front end is manufactured and where the back end are not necessarily linked, right? So if for example, the larger companies move their packaging facilities from China to Italy, or if they move it to the Philippines or whatever, then it's just that if you like, trade will just transfer to that site. So I don't think the front end location really is at risk because of the back end location.
I wanted to ask you also about maybe collaboration frameworks. As you've kind of indicated, the chip industry, or the semiconductor industry, is a huge industry with many different parts, and there isn't any one country that has all the parts that can do it all together, or there isn't indeed any single company that has all the different aspects or technologies that can do the whole thing end to end. And so it seems like collaboration is an important thing. How about collaboration levels between other EU partners and other semiconductor centres of excellence, or Taiwan, for example? Like what the EU Chips Act calls like-minded partners. And again, I ask this from the point of view of doubling Ireland's semiconductor industry by 2030 seems like a demanding challenge, and the more partners you have, it would seem like the better. What are your thoughts on that?
Again, I think you're probably, there's an implied negativity in some respects in the question, because there is huge collaboration already between countries. Horizon Europe is based on collaboration between, all the R&D projects, if you like, across all industries are based on collaboration between member states and the various institutions and industry and academia and so forth. So the Horizon Europe program, already, if you like, to some extent addresses that. And really what the CHIPS Act does, it just kind of emphasizes that we want to, more, if you like, dependence or more, just emphasizing that these are the areas we need to be looking at, right? So that collaboration. Speaking on behalf of Tyndall, we have very strong relationships with what we would consider our equivalents in other countries. So, for example, IMEC, LESI, which is in Belgium, LESI in France, the Fraunhofers. And one of the pillars of the CHIPS Act is to create these pilot lines for new technologies. And again, as you just pointed out, no one of those facilities can, in and of itself, create the entire pilot line. So we're working with these various other national institutes or other RTOs, as they're called, to what portion will Tyndall, for example, participate in. So yes, I think there is already a high degree of collaboration, especially certainly at the R&D end, and certainly at the, if you like, the certainly at the R&D end and at the pilot line level, and that comes from within the CHIPS framework as well. And I think that's an important point because Tyndall, has a response or has responded to the CHIPS Act in where areas it's working. I'm sure the IDA are doing theirs. EI will doing their role. I think what we just need is, if you like, an umbrella to say this is our concerted response, if you like, in its total to the CHIPS Act, which is, again, why I think we need a national strategy for semiconductors basically on it.
Great. So final question I want to ask you is regards the funding again. So the EU CHIPS Act funding model, in other words, the allowance of state funding under the new EU rules, is proving a little controversial. According to a recent newspaper article, Michael Lohan of the IDA said that there's a shift in the world of foreign direct investments and the beginning of a high-stakes subsidy race between developed countries and economies around the world. And he went on to say that at an industrial policy level, it's probably one of the biggest shifts in probably a decade or two. And this may make it difficult for small EU states like Ireland to compete in this environment. Some say that, the lure of our low corporate tax rate is no longer what it was, and so that won't overcome that challenge. Others add, that, instead of spending billions of euros on the chips industry, we should be investing in infrastructure and housing and other areas that the state needs. Whereas others still will say, that Ireland should make a meaningful contribution to common European objectives and EU strategic autonomy by investing in the EU chips industry. So what's your view on this funding, and how should this play into Ireland's overall chip strategy?
Well, I suppose that's a big question, right, and very very high level question. As I said earlier, definitely, obviously, the CHIPS Act allows more member states to put more money in, and therefore for the bigger projects, Ireland may not be able to compete for this. If you want to call them subsidies, whatever they call them, that we will not put in that much money, right? But as I said earlier on, the industry is vast. So rather than having necessarily just one high profile, if you like, TSMC with 5 or 10,000 people in Germany, having 3 or 4 or 500 company setups in Ireland is suitable for us and for our size and so forth. And I think Ireland always had a package, as in it wasn't just tax. It wasn't, it is a combination of things. It's a combination of English speaking. It's a combination of, if you like, a stable environment, a business friendly environment, and so forth. It also has the talent, which I think we can't underestimate. And it had an ecosystem, an R&D ecosystem, and so forth. So yes, one of those pillars of our, if you like, value proposition is now less than it was previously, or the stakes have higher. So really what we need to do is make sure the other ones are strengthened, right? And I think, you have to look at it in the round. And sometimes, and I'm not saying that I have a direct knowledge of this, is, it's the things that decide an investment in a location is multifactorial and can be very emotional as well. So that's why, having a chip strategy, saying that we are interested, is a really important statement in of itself. Yes, we may not be able to provide as much as another country will, but we can provide you with this, we can provide you with that, we can provide you with stable, secure electricity, green electricity, we can provide you with access to the ecosystem, we can provide you with access to government in terms of any issues need to be resolved and so forth. We can access. So there's a lot of things we can, if you like, develop, and it's in the round. Now, in terms of why would we invest in this rather than something else? As I said earlier, there's always this short term versus long term. The investments that are made in R&D and in this area are 50-year investment or half a century investment, and the problem sometimes we look too short term, like as I was talking about the companies earlier on in terms of the return of investment over the next 2 years or whatever. The investments made by whether it be the IDA or the Irish government, in bringing the analogues, the Intels, all the other companies to Ireland, have paid off manifold and multiplied and are still returning, 30, 40, 50 years later. So we've got to take it with that approach.
That's Dr. Denis Doyle, who is a semiconductor industry expert and currently board chair of the Tyndall National Institute at University College Cork. My sincere thanks to him for sharing his views and insights with us on Perspectives with Neilo. You can find out more about the topics discussed in the interview on our blog site at pwneilo.com, where we have linked Tyndall's position paper on Ireland's role in the global semiconductor industry, information on the EU Chips Act and how Chips Acts are driving semiconductor investments and the global FDI landscape, and much more. You can also follow Perspectives with Neilo on Spotify, iTunes, or your favourite podcast app, as well as on Instagram and Twitter. And that's where we leave it for now. Until the next time, thank you for listening. Slán agus beannacht.